Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. Matt's an amazing researcher, and he's discovered the Adam Bennion minutes, which are very underrated when it comes to talking about the priesthood ban. So Matt's going to talk about why these are so important. You won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. We all have great reverence for Lester Bush and his amazing, groundbreaking article that rewrote the priesthood ban, basically. But I think I heard that one of the weaknesses of that article, which is fantastic, but the weakness is he didn't go into the racial theology. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. One of the omissions of Lester Bush, so for your audience, he was not trained in history. He was a medical doctor who worked for the government. And
recently passed away, sadly.
And he was a great person. I always sent my stuff to Lester Bush. And then I think he got, was it Alzheimer's or dementia?
Yeah, I think so.
Alzheimer's, yeah. And so he was a great critic. And a couple of years ago, I sent one of my articles to him, and he'd always say, "Oh, I love this, send it back to me," or, send me your next piece. And he was just such a fine critic and always made helpful suggestions. And anyway, sent one of my articles to him, and I didn't hear from him. And I thought, oh, that's odd. He always enjoys reading my stuff. But I didn't know that how sick he was and how much it had progressed to that point. So that's what it was. He wasn't reading any more emails. But anyway, wonderful guy. And he lived in Maryland. And when he was in Southeast Asia on government assignment, his brother, who was a BYU student at the time in the late 60s, he wrote his brother Lester a letter, and he said, "Hey, I just came across, or I heard that there are some papers at BYU that deal with the Brethren's first presidency and Quorum of the 12 meeting minutes. The Adam Bennion family had donated them. You're going to want to see these." And the BYU brother knew that Lester had an interest in this topic.
Adam Bennion was a former apostle?
Adam Bennion was a former apostle whose family defied convention and donated the papers to BYU rather than the church archives.
Yay.
Where they are they're put away, a vault within a vault, and throw away the keys or eviscerate the code so nobody can get access. And so that wouldn't happen today, by the way. They would not donate papers of the Brethren today to BYU, at least institutional papers. But they did in those days. I think he died in 1953, so the family at some point in the 1950s donated the papers. They didn't have the policy in place yet. So this maverick librarian named Chad Flake, I knew him personally. He had sort of disheveled hair. He just did not look like a BYU person. I mean, and I found him delightful. He was an interesting guy. He was just a free-thinking kind of guy, and he allowed Bush's brother, I don't know how Bush's brother learned about the minutes, presumably from Chad Flake, who was the curator of the minutes. But Flake certainly let it be known that we have these minutes. So BYU Bush wrote his brother and said, "Next time you're in town, come see this." And so Bush made the arrangements with Chad Flake to see the minutes. And almost immediately, he recognized what those minutes meant. Because the minutes were part of a study that Apostle Adam Bennion had done in 1954 at President McKay's request to look into the feasibility of lifting the ban. This is in 1954. Your listeners have never heard this before.
Yeah, I haven't heard this either.
And in one of my chapters, I go into great detail about this. Anyway, so in 1954, they couldn't figure out who bore African ancestry in South Africa and Brazil. And the Brethren were bothered by this. And we now know that there's no such thing as a pure race. It's just nonsense. But they didn't know that at the time. And so they knew they were baptizing and conferring priesthood ordination on people of African lineage in these two heavily biracial and mixed race countries. And so President McKay visited South Africa and Brazil, and he came back and he said, "We've got to, do something about the ban." And so he convened this committee led by Apostle Bennion, and Spencer Kimball, we think, was on the committee. Not quite sure, because some of the records are nebulous. But Apostle Bennion asked his cousin, Lowell Bennion, with whom he was close, to assist. Whether he was an official member of the committee or just the guy behind the scenes ghostwriting everything. I don't know. I wish I knew this. What I do know is that Lowell Bennion writes the report with Apostle Bennion's approval. And in this report called the Bennion Report, it says that there's no scriptural justification for the ban. It says that the ban is pushing away our best and our brightest students, meaning at the institutes.
Mm.
They can't justify this idea of the one-drop rule and anything else, or that it's theologically compatible with Mormon scripture, that you're judged for your own sins and not for your ancestors' transgressions. Well, how can you have this pre-existent theology and you can't repent of something that you may have allegedly done in the pre-existence? So Bennion thought it was bad theology. And they also said that there was no founding document that tied the ban to Joseph Smith. I mean, I don't know who was on the committee. I wish I did. But I can tell you I know for a fact who wasn't on the committee, Joseph Fielding Smith. Because Elder Smith had spent his entire life building up this theological scaffolding that, the curse and the ban began with Joseph Smith and all of that stuff. And the only logic that they used to imply or to state that the ban began with Joseph Smith was that all of the great founding doctrines of the church started with Joseph Smith Jr. And therefore, the priesthood doctrine must have started with him too. I mean, that's not really good reasoning, especially if you believe that, God reveals line upon line or what does President Nelson say today, that the restoration's ongoing, it's evolving. Well, somehow Joseph Fielding Smith had everything, fixed in time at 1830 to 1844. So that was just bad theology on so many different levels. But so the Bennion Report was, as you can imagine, it was devastating. This is not doctrinal. This is just a policy and a practice.
And so this is where Lester Bush's punchline came from.
This is where Lester Bush
didn't start with Joseph Smith.
That's exactly right. It was from the Bennion Report. And this is also the context in which President McKay told Sterling McMurrin, his close friend, he said that the ban was a policy and a practice, not a doctrine of the church. And so some of your listeners may have heard President McKay, believe that it was a policy and a practice, not a doctrine. Well, that comes from the Bennion Report. So anyway, back to Chad Flake at BYU.
Because that's right when he was talking to Sterling McMurrin, and I think he said that to him.
That's the first person he said that to.
Yeah.
President McKay had read the Bennion Report would have been May of 1954. He read the Bennion Report, and he told Sterling McMurrin just after the report, this is not doctrinal, it's a policy and a practice. And McMurrin being actually it was April he said this to him. I'm sorry, it was late February. I'm getting this wrong, the details wrong. It was February where he read the Bennion Report, and then he told McMurrin afterwards, it was a policy and a practice. And McMurrin said, well, President McKay, General Conference is coming up in a month or so. Can you share that with the saints? Now, Sterling, I can't do that. And why he couldn't do it is because Mormon revelation requires buy-in from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants says that it has to be unanimous, the revelations. And so even though President McKay didn't think it was doctrinal, he still thought it would require a revelation to overturn the ban, which means that each member of the 12 would have to agree to it. And of course, Joseph Fielding Smith, Harold Lee, Ezra Taft Benson, Mark Peterson, and others were not going to agree to it. And so that was the context in which he told Sterling McMurrin, I can't share this with the church next week because I don't have consensus from the 12. So, but anyway, it's those minutes from that committee in 54 that get deposited at BYU. And those minutes that Elder Bennion had compiled, they began in 1830, and all the first Presidency Quorum of the 12 minutes that dealt with the race issue, he was permitted access to see from the vaults. And so he compiled them. So it went from 1830, the minutes, to 1954. That's what got donated to BYU, and that's what Lester Bush saw. And so Lester Bush published an article in Dialogue that came out in 1973, and that was the big explosion, that there is no founding document tying the prophet to the revelation or to the priesthood ban. But he didn't talk about the theology behind it. He left the scriptures out, which is, he talks a little bit about, the curse in Genesis in the Bible, but he doesn't talk about how these racialized verses in the Book of Mormon and other scriptures fit into all this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Book of Abraham. And that's something that other scholars picked up, including my good friend Newell Bringhurst.
I was just going to say that you're a co-author. You guys wrote the Gospel Topics Essays book together, and Newell's one of my favorites too.
Yeah. I dedicated Second Class Saints to the persons I dedicated was to Newell Bringhurst, who's been a close friend of mine for a long time.
Yeah, I love Newell. He's awesome.
Yeah, he is.
He's a 4-time guest too, so I'll have to get him on for number 5.
Yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah. Well, very good. I'm trying to decide. I think one of the interesting and surprising things to me, there was several, but was J. Reuben Clark. Now, I know this isn't in your book. I know Michael Quinn has referred to Clark's and David Conley Nelson too. And I hate to say this because it's a harsh word, but anti-Semitism. He was very harsh towards Jews. And so I want to contrast that with, he seemed to be a lot more open to blacks. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So I want to I think it's fair to try to give a composite to these folks.
Right.
And let them know as people. And I don't hold back my biases, whether I like somebody or maybe I find them a little like, Ugh. But Reuben Clark is an interesting person. Just to sort of give a biography before I tackle your question.
That'd be great.
He was a lawyer by training. He went to Columbia University Law School. He was sent there with the support of a person who would later become an apostle, a guy named James Talmage. Talmage was, I think, the president of the University of Utah at the time when Clark was an undergraduate. And then, as was the case in the late 19th century, if you were a Latter-day Saint in the territory of Utah and you needed to further your education, you'd have to go back east. So he went to Columbia Law School, and at Columbia, he was influenced in profound ways. He bought into eugenics, which was not a fringe theory. I hate to say that, but not a fringe theory at the time. It was something that was part of the Columbia curriculum. Harvard, a lot of places were teaching eugenics based on this idea there's a pure race and that we ought to breed so people can continue that pure race. If that sounds like, Hitler and Nazis, you'd be correct. Who also believed in the purity of bloodlines, right? So Clark finished law school. He was a brilliant man, had a good mind, and the government recognized his talents. He was a diplomat under, I think, 2 or 3 different U.S. presidents, including a diplomat to Mexico. And the Brethren in Salt Lake wanted to call him into the apostleship, which they did in 1933, because they wanted to move the church forward in Mexico. The problem is Clark had not been active in the church. Whoops. Last I knew, you probably should be maybe, going to church when you get called into the highest quorum in the church. And so Clark, got his act together and they didn't go to the temple in those days like today, that temple worship is really emphasized by today's leaders. But in those days, it wasn't. And I know this is going to be hard for your listeners to hear, maybe, especially if they're, Orthodox LDS but a lot of some of the early apostles hardly ever went to the temple, and including Reed Smoot, including Reuben Clark. So, in fairness, it wasn't just emphasized, like it is today. Anyway, so Reuben Clark got into the first presidency, and it's almost as though he's making up for lost time about being inactive. He just sort of goes the other way and becomes ultra-conservative and ultra-orthodox. And politically, he'd always been conservative, but he emerges as one of the most politically conservative of the general authorities when he's called in 1933. And Clark is a very he said something interesting, and I'm not usually critical in these kinds of things, but he said something that really bothered me. He said that I only read things that confirm what I already believe. I'm like, come on, you went to Columbia Law School. You're supposed to be an educated man. The mark of someone educated is someone who can entertain thoughts that they don't necessarily agree with. But that's what he said. I only read literature that I agree with. So Clark had been reading right-wing literature.
Mm.
And one of the people that he read frequently was a guy named Gerald Smith, who was a Nazi. He was an American Nazi. And Reuben Clark subscribes to his literature, his magazines, and he's reading all this garbage.
Now, let me ask you there, because in 33, was Hitler and Nazis seen as bad as they were in, say, World War II? They probably weren't, were they?
You mean World War I?
Because you said he joined the apostleship in 33, I think. And so if he's reading this George Smith or whatever his name was.
Gerald Smith. Yeah.
Gerald Smith. Were the Nazis seen as evil as they were after the Holocaust was discovered?
Oh, yeah. The Nazis were, in the 30s, were just, yes, it was a process, right? I mean, you don't just start killing people and sending millions of Jews to the gas chambers. There's a lead up to that point. And it starts by dehumanizing people.
Okay. So so they always had a bad reputation? Is that safe to say?
Well, with Hitler, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, of course, his thugs that he associated with.
Okay.
And maybe a different question is, did Reuben Clark understand the extent to which this is really bad stuff?
Yeah.
I don't want anyone listening today thinking that Reuben Clark supported the gassing of Jews. I don't want anyone to think that, because there's no evidence for that. And I can't imagine that a church official would do something as drastic as that. But he's reading some of the most virulent anti-Semitic literature of the day. And the fact that he's reading this and he's writing Gerald Smith letters and agreeing with Gerald Smith and just dehumanizing Jews.
Yeah.
And Reuben Clark knew this is controversial because he had exchanged pamphlets called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which I write about in my Benson book.
Right.
And I mentioned actually a little bit of this in this book, Second Class Saints. But when they exchanged the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a huge anti-Semitic tract talking about Jews are spreading communism and all of that nonsense. And so Reuben Clark told Elder Benson, who's his protege, he said that do not share the protocols with anybody. And when you're done, send it right back to me. And of course, what he was really saying was, don't share this with President Grant or David O. McKay, my fellow counselor, because they don't agree with this garbage.
Right.
And so Clark knew that it was controversial. But to your question about his views about Black people, Clark was a pragmatist. And he didn't serve a church mission. He was never a mission president, which is sort of a standard trajectory for a lot of folks in church leadership. I told you he was brought in to help out with missionary efforts in Mexico and other places because he was a very intelligent human being. So the brethren relied on his leadership. And what bothered him is that he thought it was just profoundly wrong to take a person who was biracial, we would say today, but in those days they were called mulattoes, which is terribly offensive today. We would never use that word. But so a biracial person who had light skin, but yet it was rumored that they had African ancestry. And he thought it was wrong to deny them the priesthood and the temple ordinances.
That's what really surprised me.
Yeah, he thought it was wrong because it placed them in racial no man's land. These are people who identified as white, but yet their church deems them cursed because of the one drop rule. And so he made, as I talk about this in detail in my book, Clark, who has these strong racial views towards Jews, but he made a proposal to the brethren. He said, let's ordain part Negroes to the priesthood. That's the word he used, part Negroes. So he's talking about biracial people.
Right.
Let's ordain them to the priesthood. And so that was the first thing.
So he was against full blacks.
Well, okay, so there's two reasons why he wanted part Negroes or biracial people to the priesthood. One was he didn't think it was fair because they didn't identify as black, but they identified as white, and they couldn't marry a white person because their offspring would be cursed. That was the issue. But yet they didn't want to marry a black person because they didn't identify as black. So it really put them in a no man's land, with respect to race. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that Clark, knew that there were Latter-day Saints, particularly in South Africa, who couldn't prove their racial purity. So they just simply packed up and moved to Utah and Idaho, where nobody ever asked them about their ancestry because they looked white.
Right.
And so Clark said, they're doing this anyway. Let's just ordain them to the priesthood. And of course, when I read these documents, I was shocked.
Yeah.
I thought, well, good for you. But the brethren shot it down. They didn't want it. And so he didn't get his way.
But South Africans continued to move to Utah and Idaho and get the priesthood.
Yes, they were.
And then they could go back and they were okay, right?
Well,
I don't know that they did, but.
No, they didn't go back. So it did create controversy. And in chapter 2 of my book, I go into this in some detail. But so South Africans, they had to prove their racial purity. It was the only place in the church where they had to do genealogy first to prove that they had racially pure bloodlines. And I want to just pause again for a moment. This is all nonsense. There's no such thing as a pure bloodline. If each of us goes back 200 years, we'll have at least one African indigenous ancestor. But they don't know that. And you'd think that they would have known how difficult the pure bloodlines would be because all of world history has been about interracial encounters and global migrations, right? We've created a new nomenclature of names to classify these mixed race groups, mestizos and mulattoes and all of that. Those names evolved because of these interracial encounters where people would marry and produce biracial children. But anyway, they didn't know that. And so in Africa, because it's the continent that was thought to derive from, Cain and all of that, black people, that they had to prove that they had racial purity. And South Africans were bitter about that. And can you imagine in the 50s they don't have the tools that we have today.
They don't have family search.
They don't have family search, and they just go on your phone and put in a few things and, whoa, or you pay $100 and those companies will do your ancestry for you. They have 19, 20-year-old missionaries doing the genealogy. I mean,
can't imagine.
It's a clown show. And I sound like I'm being critical, but this is what the missionaries themselves are saying. Why are they having us do this? We're not trained in this. I have some good letters like this in my research. And plus the records are spotty.
Right.
And yet so much is at stake. They can't inherit. You have to have the priest in the temple to inherit the highest degree of the celestial kingdom. So their fate in the afterlife is in jeopardy. And so the stakes are high. And so what happens is that when they can't determine that they have a racially pure bloodline, or when these light-skinned South Africans run into their ancestral line that there is somebody from sub-Saharan Africa, which is typically the part of Africa that's most dark-skinned, when that happens, they get denied the priesthood there, and they just simply move to Utah. And they get the priesthood. In the meantime, their relatives are still back in South Africa, and they can't have the priesthood. And so they write to the brethren in Salt Lake, and they say, these are people in their 50s, they'll say in 60s, my daughter just moved to Salt Lake and got married in the temple. Or my son went to Salt Lake and now he's on a mission. But I can't have the priesthood. What's going on here? In other words, if they can have the priesthood and go to the temple, why can't I?
Right.
I want to be sealed in the temple. And so that's the problem. And that's what those letters to the first presidency is what necessitated David O. McKay going to South Africa in 1954 to see the situation firsthand.
Which now I see is right after this Bennion report.
Just before the Bennion report.
Oh, it was before the Bennion report.
That's what commissions the Bennion report.
Oh.
This idea of racial detection and racial boundaries.
Okay.
because they had been telling the Brethren that people are passing below the color line. They're leaving and they're going to Utah and Idaho. And I might add that this is happening around the world around the mid-20th century. The United States, they're publishing all kinds of articles about American Negroes, as they put it,
now,
who are passing as white.
Do we know when this policy was put in South Africa?
Yeah.
Because it ended in 54, 55, right?
When you had to prove your bloodlines. Yeah, the 40s.
Yeah.
The 40s.
So it was a decade and a half, basically.
Yeah, basically. And it was one mission president, a guy named Evan P. Wright, who's the one that made the big stink.
Mm-hmm.
And the church had been in South Africa they started in 1853. It wasn't good for a lot of reasons. One of which was the missionaries never learned the language. Newsflash, there was no missionary training center in 1853.
They didn't learn Afrikaans?
They did not learn Afrikaans. And so they recognized that a lot of the folks there spoke Afrikaans and they didn't know the language. And so that was one of the main issues in 53. And so they got called home. Then they came back in 1903 and they ran into all kinds of issues with racial detection. So what they did was when they went into South Africa, I mean, they know the continent, of course. They know that there's African ancestry, of course. So what they do when they go into regions like that is they try to determine where the white regions are. And they only want to missionize in the white regions and avoid the regions where black people live. Same thing in Brazil. When they go into Brazil in 1929, they focus on the southern tip of the country where
all the Germans
are. You got it. That's exactly right. And then the northern part of Brazil they stay away from because that's the where black Brazilians live.
Well, and maybe we should just mention that really quick for people who aren't as familiar with World War II. A lot of the Nazis, when they escaped Germany, went to South America and Brazil. I mean, I remember, I think the Americans called this the rat lines because they referred to the German rats that were trying to escape and not get persecuted by the Allied, the Allies in World War II. And so a lot of them went to South America.
Yeah. So Americans, the missionaries are baptizing Nazis.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens.
Yeah.
And they know this.
But they're white, so it's okay.
But they're white. And they accepted all the provisions for baptism, and even Nazis need to be saved. So the problem
Nazis need to be saved, but blacks don't.
Well, this is a problem.
I mean, I know they could be baptized, but this is terrible.
Well, it's also what's interesting about this is my book talks about there's a lot in this book. It's history, political history, it's cultural history, there's legal history. It's a combination of different subfields in history, but there's a lot of theology. You can't do a Book of Mormon history and not talk about theology. And it creates a difficult theology because the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi 26:33, talks about all are alike unto God. The Apostle Paul talks about that God is no respecter of persons. And so black people in the church are reading these scriptures and they're writing the Brethren letters. How do you reconcile the priesthood and temple ban? We call it the priesthood and temple ban today. It was just the priesthood ban in those days. But now we recognize it as more than just a priesthood ban. But how do you reconcile the priesthood ban with this idea that all are alike unto God? These are black people writing the Brethren. And I remember reading the letter, where the black saints would be asking these questions. I'm thinking, oh man, I can't wait to read the response. Man, this ought to be good. And then you get to the response in the second part, when they respond back. But they just don't have an answer. They don't have an answer. And these Latter-day Saints, black Latter-day Saints, are very, very intuitive to this theology. And they're very intuitive to the fact that the Brethren are not answering them. They revert back to the pre-existence. And sometimes you get these exchanges where they'll read about the response, about the pre-existence, and then they'll write back, you didn't answer my question. What does the pre-existence have to do with all are alike unto God? And they don't know what to say.
Is this why they have to go talk to their stake president now?
Well, the Brethren
or their bishop.
They get so many questions from the saints. And I mean, it's probably a matter of policy. They'd never be able to function in their jobs if of course, they took the time to answer every question. But I'm telling you, as a historian, the fact that a lot of them didn't answer questions back in the day makes me happy. And I also like when their secretaries respond sometimes. When there's a hot button issue and they get dozens of letters, what happens is the general authorities will tell their secretaries, okay, we're getting all kinds of letters about this. And this is what I want you to say when you respond on my behalf. And the secretaries would always say, I am directed to tell you. And then they, which is nice because it means that I'm not speaking for my own, conscience. I'm speaking because of what my boss told me to say to you. And I see that a lot in letters too, which of course is pretty official.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's that. They struggle with that theology. And when the priesthood ban is lifted in 78, the all are alike unto God verse becomes the church's new branding efforts. And of course, everybody talks about it now. It's in
the
manuals.
I'm a Mormon campaign, is that what you're talking about?
All over the place. Yeah, we're all alike unto God, and it becomes the branding efforts. But before 1978, no apostle ever hardly talked about it. I found, I think, 2 instances, maybe one publicly in conference, that Spencer Kimball gave a sermon in 1954 about racial tolerance, but he didn't mention black people. He said, be racially tolerant. He listed Tongans and Mexicans and all these different racial groups, but not black people. But anyway, they never talked about all are alike unto God. And then after 78, it's everywhere because they're having to make up for lost time. So it's it's a really interesting play about how the brethren interpret scriptures, and it speaks to the idea that cultural contexts matter, that they start to see scriptures in a new light when the ban is lifted. Now they can really push this idea of racial equality forward, and it's a beautiful scripture. It's how I end my book, actually.
Yeah, that
the church is trying to live up to this central and founding scripture in 2nd Nephi. It's really, I think, one of the most lovely scriptures in the Book of Mormon, and it's the scriptures that I like to dwell on, not the skins of blackness and all of that. Those are racially exclusive scriptures. This one's racially inclusive, and it needs to be promoted.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Harris. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Marion D. Hanks and the famous 1969 events that led to the statement. We'll also talk a little bit about the meeting to lift the ban. And Franklin Richards had an amazing statement in that meeting. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
So Franklin Richards, as they're having this great spiritual moment, there are a lot of tears being shed. Frank Richards says, "What about the women?"
Really?
This is in Hanks's diary. And I'm laughing as I read this. What about the women? Are you kidding me?
Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.